From Tel Aviv, I'm joined by Bel Trew, the chief international correspondent for The Independent. From Dubai, I'm joined by Gregg, the Middle East editor of The Economist. And with me here in the studio is Sir Mark Lisle-Grant, one of Britain's former national security advisors. Welcome to you all. Bel, if I could start with you and just get your latest update on what's going on in Israel, particularly looking at the north border with Lebanon. What are you hearing at the moment?
Well, absolutely. I was actually speaking to Israeli military officials this afternoon about the northern border. There's been an increase, I would say, in cross-border exchange of fire between Israeli forces and the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah. And this is obviously triggering concerns about this conflict with Gaza spreading to the Middle East and the whole region. Hezbollah, which is backed by Iran, have obviously warned quite a few times that if Israel doesn't stop what's happening in Gaza, if particularly they launch a ground incursion, then there will be, more fighting. So at the moment, the concern is that this is the beginning of a wider conflict. And this is something that, Rishi Sunak himself said when he visited Israel today, that this is, would be a disaster, basically.
Yes, and turning to Gregg Carlstrom, Gregg, we've heard this evening from the Israeli Defence Minister pretty much saying, stand by, orders are coming very soon to the IDF, and therefore we expect that ground incursion to start quite soon. If that happens, do you think there is much chance of Hezbollah and Iran remaining out of this?
It's an incredibly hard thing to say. I can give you reasons why they would and reasons why they wouldn't. I mean, for Hezbollah, part of it is, as Bel was saying, they have spent weeks now making threats and they're going to feel like they need to, on some level, follow through with those threats. And that's something that might push them into this conflict. On the other hand, Lebanon is 4 years into one of the worst economic crises in modern history. And there is broad opposition in Lebanon to being involved in the war. People don't want the country to be involved, and there would be unpredictable political consequences for Hezbollah if it were seen as dragging Lebanon into a war. And I think there's also a possibility that Iran, looking at its network of proxies in the region, looking at the possibility of Hamas being severely damaged, if not eradicated, as a result of this Israeli ground invasion, might not want to risk another one, might not want to risk Hezbollah, which is the sort of crown jewel in its network of proxies, and might decide if it's going to open another front to do that via Syria, for example, rather than via Lebanon.
And Gregg Carlstrom, can I ask you, Rishi Sunak's gone to Saudi Arabia today. What do you think he's going to be wanting from the Saudis? What's he going to be asking for?
The Saudis don't have much to offer, honestly. I mean, there are two pressing issues for Rishi Sunak and for other Western leaders who have been to Israel this week. One of them is the question of humanitarian access to Gaza. Everyone has been pushing for aid to be allowed to enter and perhaps for Palestinian refugees to be allowed to flee out of Gaza into Egypt. There's been a bit of movement on that. I'm sure he'll be pushing the Saudis to contribute money to a further humanitarian effort for Gaza. Then there's the bigger question of trying to put some leverage on Hamas to talk about the release of these Israeli hostages that are being held and hopefully build on that towards a ceasefire. But that's not something Saudi has much influence on because they don't have a tremendous amount of leverage over Hamas.
And Bel Trew, we've seen a lot of Prime Minister Netanyahu with different world leaders, Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak, and many more. And he's, as it were, on the world stage. But what is the current state of Israeli public opinion about him? To what extent is he being blamed personally for what's happened?
I think it's quite hard to say, exactly what the percentages of support and for Netanyahu and also anger. But I would say there have been some quite loud demonstrations, specifically from family members of those who've been killed or family members of those who have been held hostage in Gaza against Netanyahu, saying, how could you possibly let this happen? I was down in the border regions in an area called Sderot and also in some of the kibbutzes that were impacted by this horrific attack that took place on the 7th of October. And the resounding question was, how did this happen? There's $1 million fence between Israel and Gaza. It's supposed to be this huge army with an iron dome, and people feel that this is probably the responsibility of Netanyahu. And it's quite interesting because there's people across the political divide who are sort of angry with him, because you've got the sort of more hardliners who are saying we should have been harsher towards Hamas in the past, and you've also got his natural political opposition who are saying that his policies that he's taken are the reason why. But I will say there does tend to be be some, growing support for the military, at least here, I think. The sort of calls for peace are voices I'm not hearing so much on the ground here in Israel.
Very interesting. So, Mark, I'd like to talk to you about the situation here in the UK. But before I do, what is your view of the long-term situation here? People are saying the two-state solution is now completely dead. It's off the table. But if that's the case, how do we come out of whatever's going to happen? How do we come out of a war in the Middle East?
It's a very difficult question to answer that, Andrew, because even if Israel is successful in its stated objective of destroying Hamas as a military capability organization, destroying it as a political organization, at the end of this conflict, Palestine will continue to be there. Gaza will continue to be there. The Palestinian cause will continue to be there. And I think there's a lot of heart-searching in private, certainly in Western capitals, and possibly even in the private conversations with Netanyahu about the day after. What happens after you withdraw from Gaza?
Yes.
Because this issue has not gone away, and Israel's attempts to manage it by purely security means over the last 15 years has not succeeded.
Right at the start of the show, I was quoting the new extremism commissioner saying that he thought that Britain now had a permissive atmosphere for anti-Semitism. And we heard from Tracy Ann Oberman, the actress, about how many Jews in Britain feel very isolated and scared at the moment. From the national security point of view, how likely is it that we're going to see a blowback from the Middle East on the streets of Britain? Another big demonstration happening at the weekend.
Well, I think there's a high risk of that, and indeed a high risk of that sort of blowback turning into sort of terrorist acts. We've seen that happen in Brussels. We've seen that happen in France. We've seen a rise in anti-Semitism in this country, maybe even a rise also in Islamophobia. So I think the risk is absolutely there.
We're all sort of waiting nervously. As a former national security advisor, so what happens next? Is there a raising of the security levels? Who does that and how does it happen?
Well, if MI5 will be watching this situation very closely, and if they consider that they're beginning to get chatter on mobile phones, maybe they're obviously people that they keep under surveillance, that they look as though they're moving towards action rather than just rhetoric, then I think there may be a consideration of raising the threat level. The threat level at the moment is substantial, which means that a terrorist attack is likely, but raising it to severe means it's highly likely. And that is a decision.
Means more police on the streets, more observation by the security services.
It would mean that, and possibly restricting the number of demonstrations allowed at one time.
Right, of course. Gregg, can I ask you whether you are receiving any information or any sense in your waters almost of when the attack on Gaza might begin?
No, I mean, everyone thought it was going to begin a week ago, and everyone is surprised at the delays. There have been some reports out of Israel today that some of the reservists who were called up 2 weeks ago are being demobilized. There are some concerns that there have been troops ready on the border for 2 weeks, and they can't sustain that level of readiness for long. I think now that President Biden is gone, now that Rishi Sunak has finished his trip, now that this convoy of Western leaders seems to have ended for the time being, that clears one obstacle to it. I think the Israelis have also prepared the northern border in case a second front there opens. So my suspicion would be that it's going to happen in the next few days, but that's not based on any hard information.
Sure. And Bel, you're in Tel Aviv. Is that the atmosphere? Is that the expectation where you are?
Well, I mean, I agree completely with what Gregg was saying in terms of these reservists being called back, but there's a quite interesting statement that was made by the Israeli defense minister today. He went to the Gaza border and talked about basically troops, potentially being inside Gaza quite soon, saying you'll soon see the inside of Gaza. That, of course, could just be about rallying morale, because there have been reports from Israeli media that soldiers are feeling like they've been stuck on this border under rocket fire, not really doing anything. So that could be a morale booster. But and I still think there is going to be some big questions about whether they actually go in a traditional sense of a ground invasion because of this threat from the northern border and the concerns, of course, for the hostages inside Gaza. But certainly we're getting these mixed signals. And as Gregg said, Western leaders have left. So that has cleared that barrier. But we'll just have to see. I think, it's just speculation at this time.
Yeah. Bel, Gregg and Sir Mark, thank you all very much for talking to me tonight. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in the last few days about a possible invasion of Gaza. You just heard more of it just now. Earlier in the show, I spoke to John Amble, who's a former US military officer, and he's a specialist at West Point in urban warfare. He described the difficulty Israeli troops could face if they do invade.
Every window, every door, every rooftop, around every corner is a potential firing point, is a potential sniper position. Add on top of this the fact that there are an estimated 300 miles of tunnels crisscrossing underneath the surface of Gaza that enables Hamas fighters to move around, pop up, conduct an attack. It's a major challenge.